languages. What united them all was an unmistakable air of expectancy, a collective hope that seemed to create its own atmosphere. Inside the building, Grace was overwhelmed by the scale and beauty of the sanctuary. The ceiling soared high above them, supported by graceful arches that drew the eye upward toward elaborate stained glass windows. Despite the modern construction, there was something ancient and sacred about the space, as if it had been designed to facilitate encounters with the divine. The seating capacity was enormous. Grace estimated that the sanctuary could hold at least 5,000 people, but every section was filling rapidly. Ushers dressed in pristine white uniforms moved efficiently through the crowd, helping people find seats and answering questions with warm professionalism. The organization was impeccable, with none of the chaos or confusion Grace had experienced at some other large religious gatherings. The stage area was particularly impressive, with multiple levels creating visual interest and providing clear sight lines from every seat in the house. Professional lighting equipment was suspended from the ceiling, and large screens flanked the stage to ensure that everyone could see clearly regardless of their location in the sanctuary. The overall effect was one of careful preparation and attention to detail that spoke to the significance of what was about to take place. As Grace and Connell found their seats about halfway back from the stage, Grace noticed that many of the women around them were carrying small bags or purses that seemed to contain more than the usual items. Some had bottles of oil, others carried special handkerchiefs or prayer cloths, and several had notebooks, similar to the one Grace had brought to record her own experience. The woman sitting next to Grace introduced herself as Patience and explained that this was her third visit to a miracle service. Her first pregnancy, after 8 years of trying, had occurred following her initial visit 18 months earlier. She had returned to give testimony and was now seeking prayer for a second child. Patience spoke with quiet confidence about Prophetess Deborah's gift, describing the physical sensations she had experienced during prayer and the dramatic changes in her body that had followed. "You can feel when something shifts," Patience explained, her voice barely above a whisper as more people continued filing into the sanctuary. "It's not just emotional or spiritual, it's physical. You know something real has happened, even before the medical tests confirm it." Grace found Patience's testimony both encouraging and intimidating. The idea that she might experience something so tangible during the service was thrilling, but it also raised her expectations in a way that made her nervous. What if she didn't feel anything? What if her faith wasn't strong enough to receive the kind of breakthrough that others had experienced? The service began with an extended period of worship that was unlike anything Grace had encountered in her regular church attendance. A full orchestra and choir of at least 100 voices led the congregation in songs that seemed specifically chosen to build faith and expectancy. The music was both contemporary and deeply spiritual, with lyrics that spoke directly to situations of waiting, hoping, and believing for miraculous intervention. Grace found herself swept up in the collective energy of thousands of voices raised in unified song. The sound was overwhelming in the best possible way, creating an atmosphere that felt charged with possibility. Around her, people were not just singing but physically expressing their faith, hands raised, bodies swaying, some people weeping openly as they sang words that clearly resonated with their personal struggles. The worship continued for nearly an hour, with seamless transitions between songs that maintained the emotional momentum while allowing people to enter deeper levels of spiritual engagement. Grace noticed that as the music progressed, the congregation seemed to become more unified, more focused, more expectant. Individual voices began to fade into a single, powerful expression of collective faith and hope. When the music finally concluded, the sanctuary fell into a profound silence that felt heavy with anticipation. Grace could hear her own heartbeat in the quiet, could sense the focused attention of thousands of people, all waiting for the same moment. The stage lighting shifted subtly, creating a more intimate atmosphere while maintaining the sense of sacred drama that had built throughout the worship time. Prophetess Deborah emerged from behind the stage with a presence that immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the building. In person, she was even more striking than she had appeared in photographs and videos. Tall and graceful, she moved with the confident authority of someone who was completely comfortable in her role and certain of her calling. Her green and gold robe seemed to catch and reflect the stage lights, creating an almost otherworldly effect as she approached the podium. But it was her eyes that captured Grace's attention most completely. Even from her seat halfway back in the sanctuary, Grace could see the intensity of Prophetess Deborah's gaze as she surveyed the congregation. There was something penetrating about her look, as if she could see not just the physical gathering before her, but the spiritual needs and deep longings of each individual person present. "Welcome, sons and daughters," Prophetess Deborah began, her voice carrying clearly throughout the sanctuary without seeming forced or artificially amplified. "You have come from near and far, carrying burdens that have grown heavy with time, nursing hopes that have been deferred until your hearts are sick with waiting. But I want you to know that your season of waiting is about to end." The congregation responded with a collective sound that was part sigh, part cry of hope, part release of long-held tension. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes at the prophetess's words, surprised by how directly they seemed to speak to her specific situation. Around her, she could see other people having similar emotional responses, faces lighting up with renewed hope and possibility. Prophetess Deborah continued speaking, her message weaving together biblical promises, personal testimonies from previous services, and prophetic declarations about what God wanted to accomplish in the lives of those present. Her speaking style was conversational yet authoritative, warm yet commanding, creating an atmosphere where people felt both comfortable and awed. "The enemy has whispered lies to you," the prophetess declared, her voice rising with passion. "He has told you that you are forgotten, that your prayers are unheard, that your dreams are impossible. But today, we break the power of those lies. Today, we speak the truth over your situations. Today, we call forth the miracles that God has already prepared for you." Grace found herself hanging on every word, feeling as if the message had been crafted specifically for her circumstances. The prophetess spoke about the pain of unfulfilled longing, the exhaustion that comes from hoping month after month without seeing results, the way infertility can make women feel broken or defective. But she also spoke with absolute conviction about God's power to override natural limitations and create life where medical science said it was impossible. The biblical examples Prophetess Deborah cited were familiar to Grace, but they seemed to take on new meaning in this context. Sarah, Abraham's wife, who conceived Isaac in her old age. Hannah, who had been barren until God opened her womb to give birth to the prophet Samuel. Elizabeth, who conceived John the Baptist despite being past childbearing age. These weren't just ancient stories, according to the prophetess, but patterns that God was still following in the lives of contemporary women who would dare to believe. God specializes in impossible situations, Prophetess Deborah declared, her voice echoing through the sanctuary. The more impossible your situation appears, the greater the glory he receives when he turns it around. Your years of waiting have not been wasted. They have been preparation for a testimony that will encourage thousands of other women who are walking the same path you have walked. As the message continued, Grace became aware that something was shifting in her own heart. The chronic sadness and resignation that had become so familiar were being replaced by something she hadn't felt in years, genuine, unguarded hope. Not the careful, protected hope that she had learned to manage, but the kind of bold expectation that believed miraculous things were not just possible but probable. The prophetess began sharing specific testimonies from recent services, providing details that made the miracles feel concrete and accessible. She spoke about Martha, a 45-year-old woman who had been told by doctors that her eggs were no longer viable, but who had conceived naturally just 3 weeks after receiving prayer. She described Rebecca, who had suffered through 9 miscarriages before finally carrying a pregnancy to term following ministry at the sanctuary. Each testimony was accompanied by photographic evidence displayed on the large screens flanking the stage. Grace saw ultrasound images, birth certificates, family photos, and medical documentation that verified the miraculous nature of these pregnancies. These weren't vague spiritual claims, but documented medical impossibilities that had been transformed into living proof of divine intervention. "Your situation is not too hard for God," Prophetess Deborah proclaimed, her gaze seeming to make direct contact with individuals throughout the congregation. "The same power that created life in the beginning is available to create life in your womb. The same God who has done this for hundreds of other women is ready to do it for you." Grace felt as if the prophetess was speaking directly to her, as if somehow this woman could see her specific circumstances, and was addressing her personal need. The feeling was both thrilling and slightly unnerving, but it filled Grace with a level of expectation that she hadn't experienced since the early days of her infertility journey. The message concluded with Prophetess Deborah's announcement that it was time for the altar call, the moment when women seeking miraculous pregnancies would come forward for individual prayer. Grace's heart began racing as she realized that this was the moment she had traveled so far to experience, the opportunity that might change everything about her future. "If you are a woman who has been waiting for the blessing of a child," the prophetess called out, "if you have been through the pain of infertility, if doctors have told you that pregnancy is impossible, if you have lost hope that you will ever hold your own baby, then this is your moment. God is calling you to step out in faith and receive what He has been preparing for you." Grace looked at Connell, who nodded encouragingly and squeezed her hand. Around them, women were beginning to stand and move toward the stage area, some walking with confident determination, others moving more hesitantly, as if they weren't sure they deserved to claim this opportunity for themselves. Taking a deep breath that felt like it contained all of her hope and fear, Grace stood up and joined the stream of women making their way forward. As she walked toward the stage, she felt as if she was walking toward her destiny, toward the answer to 14 years of desperate prayer, toward the miracle that would finally make her a mother. The altar area filled quickly with women of all ages, creating a sea of hopeful faces that stretched across the front of the sanctuary. Grace found herself standing among dozens of other women, each carrying her own story of longing and disappointment, each hoping that today would mark the end of her waiting. The collective energy was palpable, a mixture of desperation, faith, and barely contained excitement that seemed to create its own atmosphere. Prophetess Deborah moved among the women with graceful authority, her robes flowing around her as she approached different individuals. Grace watched as the prophetess would stop in front of certain women, place her hands on their heads or shoulders, and begin speaking in low tones that only they could hear. Each interaction seemed intensely personal, as if the prophetess could discern specific details about each woman's situation without any prior knowledge. Grace noticed that some of the women would begin crying immediately when the prophetess approached them, while others would stand perfectly still, as if they were afraid to move and break whatever spiritual connection was being established. A few women seemed to experience physical sensations during the prayer, swaying slightly, raising their hands, or making soft sounds of worship and surrender. The atmosphere in the sanctuary had shifted dramatically from the earlier worship and teaching. Now there was a focused intensity, a sense that something significant was happening in the spiritual realm that would have lasting consequences in the physical world. Even the people still seated in the congregation seemed to be holding their breath, watching with rapt attention as each woman received individual ministry. When Prophetess Deborah finally approached Grace, the experience was unlike anything she had anticipated. The prophetess stopped directly in front of her, and Grace found herself looking into eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. For a moment, neither woman spoke, and Grace felt as if her entire life history was being reviewed and understood in that silent exchange. 14 years, Prophetess Deborah said quietly, her voice carrying a tone of deep compassion. 14 years of hoping, praying, believing, doubting, trying again. You have been faithful in your waiting, daughter, but your season of waiting is over. Grace gasped softly, stunned that the prophetess had known the exact length of her struggle without any previous information. She felt tears spring to her eyes, not just from emotion but from a sense of being truly seen and understood by someone who recognized the depth of her pain. The prophetess placed both hands on Grace's head, and immediately Grace felt a sensation unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was as if warm oil was being poured over her entire body, starting from the crown of her head and flowing down through every part of her being. The sensation was both physical and spiritual, bringing with it a peace that seemed to settle into her bones, and a hope that felt more solid than any emotion she had ever experienced. "Father God," Prophetess Deborah began praying, her voice rising slightly so that others nearby could hear. "This daughter has waited long enough. She has proven her faithfulness. She has endured the testing. She has held on to hope when circumstances said hope was foolish. Now we ask you to open her womb, to breathe life into her body, to create the miracle she has been seeking." As the prayer continued, Grace became aware that something was happening inside her body. She felt a distinct warmth in her lower abdomen.